Hello, my name's Charlotte Goodwin, and today I'm going to read out the first chapter of my debut novel, The General Sun. The General Sun is the first in the Offspring Trilogy, which is part of the Gallantrian Legacy series. Right, okay, so I'm going to crack on, and I hope you enjoy it. So, the location is central Kenya. We're on Earth, which is codenamed planet B13536. The Earth year is 2034. The distant mountains shimmered through the misty haze. Their snow-capped crowns floated above the expanse of Kenyan savanna below. Aaron found his gaze fixed in the distance. Fixed, but unfocused. The tricks of light weren't of interest to the exiled king. He was looking for something else. He was searching for magic. It had happened at some point in the night. The ripple that shook him awake. A prickle of power had swept through his body, making his hair stand on end, goose pimples swell, and a chill grasp his core. Magic. A wave of it. Just a little one. But he was tuned into magic. He'd spent years searching for it, meditating, concentrating, tuning every fibre of his being into the smallest trace of mystical energy. He'd grown up with magic on his homeland of Fantasia, where it was so abundant he'd never needed to search for it. But here, on Earth, the presence of magic was so faint it was barely detectable. So he'd come to this spot, where a tunnel once connected Earth to Fantasia, where a minuscule amount of magic was still baked into the ground. He was hoping he'd find a change, a disturbance, to show where the new source of power emerged from. But there was nothing. Nothing had changed here. Nothing but the rock fig, which was now in bloom. Here there was just a pile of rubble in his favourite rock, the smooth one with the flat top where I liked to sit. There were scattered trees and chirping birds. The water in the river rippled. The wind swished through the long grass. It was peaceful, beautiful, and boring. He'd had enough. He closed his eyes and shook his head to clear the fuzz. He blinked them open until his normal vision returned. He hissed a long sigh through clenched teeth, slapped his rock, and forced his numb behind to rise. He'd achieved nothing. If he was going to do nothing, he might as well do it in comfort. He turned on his heel and headed back along the track, back through his family's private game reserve, towards a Wanjiku Safari Lodge, his home. The lodge was quiet as usual. The numbers of guests had been steadily dropping for years. If Aaron cared to be honest with himself, he would have admitted that the business had been failing since his uncle's death, when he'd taken over as manager. But Aaron was not prone to constructive self-reflection. He meandered through reception, the grating chirp of the receptionist greeting him as he went. A sour-faced nod of acknowledgement was all he managed in reply as he continued towards the guest lounge. It was nice and empty, a bonus of business being bad. He collapsed into the cushions of the welcoming sofa. His head slumped back, and he stared at the ceiling. A pencil cross, which the receptionist had made at his request, was in the spot where the ceiling fan was supposed to sit, the one he'd not got round to installing. A droplet of sweat trickled down his chest, tickling his skin. He slapped his t-shirt to blot it away, harder than he'd planned, angry at the absent fan and resenting the air conditioning that dared to fail. It hadn't been serviced in a while. A pointless cost, he'd thought. Things should just work. There were only a handful of staff still working in the lodge. There were barely enough guests to cover their wages these days. He could sack the receptionist. His mother could cover that job, surely. Even at her age, it would be manageable. He shouted through to the receptionist to bring him a cold glass of cola and reached forward for the TV remote. He flicked it on. It was set to the news channel. There were so few live channels anymore that there was little else to watch. Everything seemed to be a subscription service. Yet another waste of money he thought the lodge need not spend. He was barely even focusing until his brain made sense of the images of destruction filling the screen. He'd not watched the news for a few days, and hadn't spoken to many people other than to bark orders at them. He'd not been keeping track of what was happening in Australia. He remembered hearing about a build-up of tension with China over some claim to an island or other in the South China Sea, but he hadn't paid much attention. The images of flattened cities, scattered debris, broken trees, and human bodies amongst the ruins were hard to ignore. Huge swathes of land, of towns and cities where millions once lived, had been razed to the ground. He shuffled his bottom back into the sofa and turned up the volume. These latest images have been brought to us by our own Channel 9 drones. This scene of devastation was once the city of Sydney. Little remains of this urban hub, and there are few known survivors. We have drones over every major city in Australia, and not one has been left standing. The tiny northern city of Darwin remains the biggest settlement to have avoided China's devastating nuclear attack. Initial estimates suggest around 70% of Australia's population has been wiped out, and most of the country has been rendered an uninhabitable nuclear wasteland. The receptionist arrived with Aaron's drink. He glared at her as she passed it to him. Why had it taken so long? He couldn't be bothered to chastise her this time. He would sack her before long. He continued to watch the news report. Images of the other destroyed cities flashed across the screen. He found himself in awe, glued to the images of devastation. The power unleashed by technology was immense. It dwarfed anything he could have done in Fantasia, back when he had proper magical powers, and the strength to blast away a mountainside. Those abilities had been incredible by Fantasian standards, but were nothing compared to the destructive power of nuclear weapons. He found himself wondering what he could do with that amount of energy, if there was a way to access that kind of power himself. He smiled at the thought. It was nice to dream, but not terribly realistic to think about getting his own nukes. A little more magic, though? Surely that was achievable. He took another sip of cola, and a shudder shot up his spine. The cold drink, perhaps? He took another sip. No, it wasn't. It was something else. It was like the tingle he'd felt in the night. Maybe the nukes somehow released more power. Maybe they'd tapped into something. And maybe if he tried to use them, he'd be pleasantly surprised. Aaron! His mother cackled as she stalked into the lounge. He almost jumped out of his skin. She always had an uncanny knack for sneaking up on him. He let out a sharp breath through gritted teeth. Yes, Mother. Why are you lazing around where there's work to do? He scowled, but she barely seemed to notice. Huts 5 and 8 still have leaky roofs, and you know there's no money to pay for a repair. While it's quiet, surely you could take the opportunity to fix them yourself. She genuinely expected him to do manual work. His grandfather had made him do that stuff. It had been humiliating, and now she dared to suggest he ought to return to such drudgery. His fists clenched. Or how about doing some more work on the website? Maybe we could get some more pictures, some better ones. We could offer a special offer to get people back in. Her whining cut through him like a knife. She was nagging him again. It was all she ever did. His fingernails dug into his palms. His shimmering blood boiled as the woman stood, hands on her hips, waiting for him to answer. Well, she squawked. Oh, stop it, Mother, he snapped. If you want to do work on the website, be my guest. He shot to his feet. We can barely afford to pay the receptionist. You should think about doing something yourself instead of lording it up and trying to tell everyone else what to do. His bony finger pointed at her. His words grew louder. You're not the queen anymore, he yelled. I'm the manager here, and I'm in charge. He was almost trembling with rage. His fury had erupted surprisingly quickly this time, but it was hardly surprise. Someone sobbed. He twisted towards the receptionist. She cupped her face in her hands, unashamedly weeping. The pathetic woman probably heard his outburst and realised she was for the chop. He rolled his eyes and let his gaze rest on the floor. If she knew now, he thought, at least it would save him a job later. He rotated back to glare at his mother. The woman was sympathetically gawping at the crying girl. Feeling sorry for the servants now, are you? He hissed in disgust. He could barely believe his eyes. Sympathy was weakness, and his mother never used to be weak. You used to rule a continent, he reminded her. You ruthlessly sacked whole cities. You blasted whole armies to pieces with your power. You didn't have much sympathy for ordinary people then, did you? He scowled at her past his bushy brows. You're a shadow of your former self. Coming to Earth has made you feeble. Lila's eyes narrowed to slits. Her nostrils flared. She was getting riled at last. Good. That was the woman who'd raised him. His scowl became a sneer. It seemed to make her worse. Her dark skin grew darker as blood rushed to her face. Her fingers curled. You were only the manager because of me, she replied quietly. Aaron could almost hear her heart pounding. "You would have had nowhere to go if it wasn't for me." Her voice was growing louder. "If I hadn't come and got you from the police after you first arrived." A wicked smile crept up on her face. "The crazy man, they called you. The man who spoke no language anyone understood." Her smile dropped. "You'd have been left alone with no money, nowhere to stay, with nothing." She was almost shouting. The receptionist had ceased crying and seemed to be cowering. "It was me who persuaded my father to let you stay after you were such a bad worker, after you skived time and time again, and were rude to the guests," she yelled. Aaron felt himself brace in the face of her onslaught. "You'd have been out on your way years ago if it weren't for me. If I hadn't covered for you, done your chores, made excuses and spent hours patiently trying to teach you English when you were such a terrible student, do you think you'd be here, as manager? It's a tragic fact that my brother and his family sadly died," she continued. "But it worked out for you, didn't it? He'd never have tolerated you. When he was in charge, the place ran like clockwork. We were fully booked every week of the year. The profits flowed in. But now you have run this place into the ground. I'm glad my father isn't alive to see what you've done to his legacy, destroying everything he worked hard to build. I know I'm not a queen anymore. Do you know you're not a king?" The nerve was struck. The raw one. A red-hot poker on tender flesh. She'd reminded him of what could have been, what he was so close to achieving before he was tricked by Mark, before he was foolish enough to believe the man who lied so well had managed to dupe Aaron's magical senses. Aaron had been a king. He'd been the most powerful man in Fantasia, and now he was a manager of a failing safari lodge in Kenya. His fingernails drew blood in his palms. With the anger came the magic. But this time it was different. This time it was stronger. He was sure of it. The adrenaline pumped the mystic energy through his veins. He trembled. The urge to unleash the power became overwhelming. Red mist clouded his vision as a tingling spread down his arms. He forced a sharp intake of breath. Rational thought took over. He shouldn't waste his power. Not like this. Not on her. She was his mother, after all, and he had other uses for his magic. Magic could breed magic. Magic could help him find more. Her narrowed eyes now showed their whites as she backed away with a tentative step. Sensing her fear felt good. It made the magic stronger. He took a few deep breaths and turned from her, body tensed. He stormed towards a lodge entrance and out into the gardens. He marched along the lodge driveway. He ignored the weeds growing through the cracks in the paving. He ignored the bushes in desperate need of a prune. He didn't care about the rotten fence or the rust on the sign at the entrance. He didn't care about the lodge. He just cared about finding more magic. He headed through the gates and back out into the bush. He stomped along the path towards the river. The long grass brushed against his legs, and the calls of the distant herd of wildebeest, thousands strong, swept across the plains. The sun beat down, and shimmering waves of rising air blurred the distant mass of purple mountains. Such a tranquil place, a place of calm and peace. But Aaron didn't care. Aaron was blind to everything but his fury. He kept running through his mother's words in his head. After a short walk, he arrived at his destination, back at his favourite rock by the river, the place he always visited to search for magic. Old habits die hard. He sat on his rock and closed his eyes. He breathed deeply, concentrated on the magic, searching for every last tingle of energy coursing through his veins. He embraced his rage. He let it draw the power. He could feel it engaging with a magical field outside of himself. It was easier this time. The wind swished through the leaves on the trees, and the hot African sun beat down on his caramel skin as he sat meditating. His hands gripped his knees, and his head flopped back as he strained with everything he had to feel the magic. He let his senses trace the magical flow, those fleeting wisps that were always so hard to grasp. His fury still raged. He let his mother's words run through his mind again, and he let his ire grow. Round the wisps flew. His inner eye traced them. He watched them drift, and he noticed something. They were travelling from left to right, meandering like a great serpentine river gliding through the air. He stood, his eyes still closed, allowing himself to feel the flow. The tiny currents brushed against his flesh. He was facing south. The slight tingling came from his left. He turned to the east. The tingling moved to his front. He let the minuscule prickles tickle his chest. Then he opened his eyes. All he could see was the shimmering air, the rippling haze where the ground faded into the sky. There were no mountains to the east, just the savannah, towns and farms, and the sea. The Indian Ocean, then Indonesia. South of that was Australia, if he was getting his Earth's geography right. Last night, Australia was nuked. Today, magic flowed from the east. He had no idea if there was a connection, but he knew he'd found more power, and he was determined to find its source. Okay, so that's the end of my first chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to find out what happens next, make sure you tune in to hear me read out the next chapter in the book, which I'll be doing in a week's time. To keep up to date with all my chapters, to look at the archives or anything else, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Gallantrian Legacy. If you want more details about my books, my series, or anything else about myself, make sure you check out my website, which is charlottegoodwin.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye.